Welcome to Moonlight Mysteries, a calm space for long, research-rich mysteries. If you enjoy these sleepy deep dives, please like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss new episodes. If you'd like to support the channel, a quick comment with your favorite moment helps more people find us. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin. The Somerton Man. Chapter 1. A Body on the Beach. There is a particular quality to the light in Adelaide in late November. It comes off the water of St. Vincent Gulf in long, flat sheets, warm, and almost amber by late afternoon. The kind of light that makes everything look more permanent than it is. The limestone facades of the city buildings, the wide colonial avenues, the beach suburbs stretching south along the coast. Glenelg is one of those suburbs, a seaside town that had been a fashionable destination since the 19th century, with its long jetty pushing out into the calm water, its esplanade, its tea rooms and bathing shacks. In the decades after the Second World War, it had settled into a comfortable domesticity, working class and lower middle class families, boarding houses, a tram connecting back to the city, the kind of ordinary seaside suburb that serves as the backdrop to summer in a particular kind of Australian life. On the morning of December 1st, 1948, a person walking along the esplanade noticed a man still lying against the seawall in the same position they had seen him the previous evening, hours earlier, when they had assumed he was simply resting after a long day. Coming closer, they understood at once that something was wrong. The man was dead. The police arrived to find him just as the witnesses had described. He was lying in a composed posture, head resting against a stone, legs extended in front of him, feet crossed at the ankle, as if he had leaned back and let consciousness leave him quietly. He appeared to be in his mid-40s. He was 5 feet 11 inches tall, in excellent physical condition, well muscled across the chest and calves, with large hands. His hair was reddish-brown. His eyes were hazel. His clothing was clean and pressed, a brown double-breasted suit jacket, a white shirt, a red, white, and blue tie, polished brown shoes. He had no hat, which was unusual for a man of his apparent class in that era. He carried no identifying documents, no wallet, no letters, no passport, no papers of any kind. And so began one of the most enduring and genuinely strange unsolved mysteries in Australia history. The man on the beach at Somerton would become known simply as the Somerton Man, or sometimes with a different emphasis as the Tamam Shud Man, a name that would only acquire its meaning weeks later, after a discovery so strange it has never been adequately explained. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The beginning of any mystery is always the surface, the beach, the body, the still December morning, the composed face of a man who chose, or was made, to be nobody. Everything else radiates outward from there. And the further outward you go, the stranger and more resistant to explanation it all becomes. Chapter 2. The Evidence on His Person. The police who examined the scene were meticulous about recording what they found. In his jacket pockets, an Army Club cigarette tin containing 7 cigarettes, but not Army Club cigarettes. They were Players, a different brand, moved into the foreign tin, presumably by the man himself. The tin was a common object, a way of keeping cigarettes protected from humidity, the kind of minor practical adaptation that many smokers used. But the brand mismatch suggests a particular attitude toward material possessions. He had a tin, he had cigarettes, and he kept them together without any concern for whether they matched. This might mean nothing at all, or it might point towards someone accustomed to moving with whatever was at hand. The sensibility of a person who didn't keep a fixed home where favorite objects awaited on shelves. Also in his pockets, a box of Byron and May matches, a packet of juicy fruit chewing gum, a comb, a used bus ticket from the city to Glenelg, and an unused second-class rail ticket from Adelaide to Henley Beach, a coastal suburb about 12 kilometers north of where he was found. There was no wallet. There was no money. His shoes, on closer inspection, had been recently resoled, using stitching more consistent with American manufacturing practice than with Australian or British shoemaking. A Goodyear welt, the characteristic American method of attaching a sole to an upper using a strip of leather running around the perimeter, was done with slightly different stitch count and thread type in American factories than their British and Australian counterparts. The examiner could not say the shoes were made in America, only that whoever resold them used methods consistent with American practice. Perhaps most striking was what was missing. Every label had been removed from every piece of clothing. Not one single garment retained a manufacturer's label, a laundry mark, a tailor's tag. Whoever had prepared this man for his death, or whoever this man was if he had prepared himself, had systematically excised every identifying trace from his wardrobe. This takes deliberateness. You have to go through each garment, find each label, and cut or unpick it from the seam. Someone had done exactly that. This act of erasure transforms what might otherwise be a straightforward case of an unidentified person into something that announces its own strangeness. This is not an accident. This is intent. The body was taken to the Royal Adelaide Hospital, where pathologist John Dwyer conducted a post-mortem examination. He found that the man had died sometime between approximately 2 and 4 in the morning, though the warm December night made a precise time of death difficult to pin down. There were no external injuries and no signs of a struggle. His face was relaxed. What Dwyer found internally was more troubling: acute congestion in the stomach, the liver, the spleen, and the brain. The pupils were of unequal sizes, a condition called anisocoria, suggesting neurological involvement. The blood was darker than normal, indicating possible interference with oxygenation. The stomach contained part of a pasty, suggesting he had eaten within a few hours of his death. Dwyer's conclusion was that the man had almost certainly been poisoned, but that the specific poison could not be identified with the tools available to him. The tests of 1948 found nothing. The toxicological question was left open, and has stayed open ever since. Chapter 3: The Suitcase at the Station. For several weeks, no one came forward to claim him. His photograph was published in Adelaide newspapers and circulated to other Australian jurisdictions. Interpol was notified. He lay unclaimed in the hospital morgue, refrigerated, an unusual step reflecting the hope that eventually someone would come forward. Nobody did. Then, in mid-January of 1949, police searching the luggage storage facilities at Adelaide Railway Station found an unclaimed suitcase. It had been deposited at the cloakroom on the 30th of November, the day before the body was found. The lock had been forced at some point. Inside, police found a collection of clothes and personal items whose labels, like those of the dead man's clothing, had all been removed. The suitcase contained a red checked dressing gown, slippers with orange rubber soles, 4 pairs of underpants, pajamas, shaving equipment, a table knife that had been sharpened to a more pointed shape, a stenciling brush of the kind used to mark cargo, a screwdriver, and various other small items. The sharpened knife and the stenciling brush have attracted considerable speculation. The knife is self-explanatory enough as an object, a domestic implement converted into something more useful or more threatening. The stenciling brush is a working tool. Dock workers, freight handlers, transport workers, and military supply personnel use them to mark boxes, crates, and pallets. It is not something a tourist or a casual traveler would carry. Its presence suggests the man had a professional connection to logistics, shipping, or cargo, or in the opinion of some researchers, some kind of covert operational work where the movement of goods needed to be managed or monitored. Crucially, the suitcase's contents did contain partial identifying markings, a contrast with the body's clothing, which had been stripped of everything. On several items, including a singlet, a tie, and a laundry bag, the name T. Keene appeared in laundry marking. On a pair of trousers in the coat lining, the partial name Keene. Police conducted extensive inquiries for any person named T. Keene who had gone missing around this period, investigating the name across Australia, New Zealand, Britain, the United States, and Ireland. They wrote to shipping companies, transport firms, military records office, and municipal registries. They checked armed forces discharge records. They consulted hospital lists for missing patients. No match was ever conclusively established. The King markings are one of the more genuinely puzzling details in the case. If someone had gone to the effort of removing all labels from the on-bodying clothing, why would the suitcase contents retain any marking at all? One possibility is that the clothing labels were removed by someone other than the man himself, someone who prepared his appearance for a final public presentation, but did not have access to the separately stored luggage. Another is that Keene was a deliberately planted false name, a trail laid to mislead investigators. A third, and perhaps the most mundane, is that the clothing had passed through multiple hands before reaching the dead man, and Keene was simply a previous owner with no connection to the case. The name remains one of the many open threads. The suitcase's timeline suggests the following. On November 30th, 1948, the Somerton Man arrived in Adelaide, deposited his bag at the station, and carrying only the items found in his pockets and the book that would later become central to the investigation, made his way to Glenelg. He sat down against the seawall at Somerton Beach, facing the water. He died. The suitcase waited in the cloakroom for 6 weeks before anyone thought to look for it. Chapter 4. The Tamam Shud Slip. The formal inquest into the man's death was held in June of 1949, nearly 7 months after the body was found. The coroner, Thomas Erskine Cleland, presided over proceedings that are extraordinary reading. A formal legal process extending its full machinery of inquiry toward a mystery and finding nothing but deeper mystery in return. During preparation of the body for the inquest, something happened that had not happened in the months since the initial discovery. Tucked deep inside a small fob pocket in the man's trousers, a secondary pocket, a pocket within a pocket, sewn into the waistband and accessible only through a narrow opening. A pathologist's assistant found a tiny, tightly rolled piece of paper. It measured approximately 1 inch long and half an inch wide. On it, in small but clear type, were 2 words, Tamam Shud. The police examined the paper carefully. The type had come from a printed book. The font, the paperweight, and the quality of the print were consistent with a published work. The phrase was Persian. Tamam Shud means, in Farsi, it is finished, or it is ended. In the context of classical Persian poetry, it carries the weight of a conclusion. Something has reached its close. A door has been shut. The phrase was eventually traced to its source, the final 2 words of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, in the particular edition published by the New Zealand firm Whitcomb and Tomb. This was a small pocket-sized version, the kind a person might carry for years. Police appealed to the public. Had anyone found a copy of this edition with those final 2 words torn from the last page? On July 23, 1949, a man came forward. He said the book had been found some weeks around December 1st of the previous year in the unlocked back seat of his car, which had been parked near the Somerton foreshore. The book was the right edition. When police examined its final page, the word Tamam Shud had been torn from it, and the torn edge matched the fragment found in the dead man's pocket with precision. A physical chain now connected the man to the book to the car, and the car to the beach. Whatever had happened that December evening, it had involved this volume. But the book contained more. Chapter 5. The Code. Under ultraviolet light, on the back cover of the Rubaiyat, investigators found faint markings, indentations left by a pencil that had been erased, but whose impressions remained in the paper beneath. These formed a sequence of capital letters arranged in 5 lines. There was also a telephone number. The letter sequence, as it was transcribed, reads WRGOABABD space MLIAOI space WTMTSTMPB space MPANETP space MLIABOAIAQC. The second line, LMIAOI, had a line struck through it, as if the writer had decided to cancel it. The sequence has been the subject of intense analysis for more than 70 years. It is the most studied piece of apparent ciphertext in Australian history, and it has never been convincingly decoded. What cryptographic analysis has concluded, and it is worth being precise here, because popular accounts often either over-dramatize the code's solvability or dismiss it as meaningless, is that the sequence is too short to yield to formal frequency analysis, which requires a much larger sample of text to establish reliable statistical patterns. English frequency analysis depends on identifying the most common letters in a sample, comparing them against known frequencies in English prose, and working outward from there. The sequence of roughly 70 letters is simply too small for this approach to produce a result that is statistically meaningful. rather than random. You would need several hundred characters of ciphertext to begin working productively with frequency analysis. The distribution of letters is unusual in ways that exceed what you would expect from chance variation in a small sample. Certain characters appear with the frequency inconsistent with natural English, in the near absence of the letter E, by far the most common letter in English, appearing roughly 12% of the time in ordinary prose, is notable. Counting the letters in the sequence, E appears not at all or nearly not at all, depending on how the markings are transcribed. This suggests either that the letters are not drawn from natural English prose, or that they are abbreviations, or the interpretation favored by most serious analysts that they represent the initial letters of words in a longer message, a form sometimes called an acrostic or initialization code. If the letters are initials, the sequence becomes essentially uncrackable without knowing the specific system used to generate it. You could produce thousands of coherent phrases whose initial letters match WRGOABABD. The struck through second line suggests a compositional process. The writer was working something out, made an error, or changed their mind in one pass, crossed it out, and continued. Whether this is a cipher being composed, a draft list of some kind, or a set of instructions being refined is unknowable from the letters themselves. Among the more technically serious proposal is the poem code hypothesis, an encryption method used extensively by British intelligence services during the Second World War, in which senders and recipient agree on a specific text as the key, and messages are encoded by reference to the positions in letters of specific words in that text. The SOE, Britain's wartime special operations executive, which trained agents for operations in occupied Europe, used poem codes extensively before abandoning them for more secure one-time pad systems in the early 1940s. If the Rubaiyat itself was the encoding key, if the book and the code were designed to be used together, then the letter sequence might only be readable by someone who held an identical copy of the same edition and knew the same encoding convention. This interpretation is elegant because it gives the entire constellation of physical evidence a coherent operational logic. The book is the key. The code is the message. The torn phrase is the confirmation that the session is complete. But it remains impossible to verify without the second copy that would have been held by the intended recipient, and no such second copy has ever been found. A less discussed but important proposal is that the sequence is not a cipher at all, but a personal mnemonic, initial letters of names, places, or instructions that needed to be remembered for an upcoming meeting or task, and that were never intended to be decoded by anyone else. If this is the case, the code is not a message sent. It is a note kept. It was found because it was not meant to be found at all. The struck through second line under this interpretation represents a correction in personal shorthand. The writer started one formulation, decided it was wrong, and tried again. Not a cipher in error, but a reminder under revision. The sequence has also attracted generations of amateur cryptographers, and the history of amateur attempts is in its own way an interesting document. Over the decades, dozens of enthusiasts have proposed solutions claiming to have found Russian phrases, German military codes, or messages encoded with various cryptographic systems. None has withstood scrutiny. The most disciplined conclusion, reached repeatedly by analysts with genuine expertise, is also the most uncomfortable. Without knowing the system and the key, the sequence cannot be decoded, and the two things most likely to provide that knowledge, a matching recipient who could explain the system, or an intelligence file that identify the man in his operational context, are both unavailable. Chapter 6. The Telephone Number in Justine. The telephone number found in the Rubaiyat's back cover was an Adelaide number of the era, 5 digits, the format used in South Australia, before the telephone system expanded in the late 1950s. The number was traced to a woman. Police interviewed her, for reasons that remained somewhat opaque, partly journalistic convention of the era, partly what appeared to have been requests by the woman or by police acting in her interest. Her name was suppressed in all public records for decades. She became known in the case literature under a pseudonym, Justine. The name was derived from a handwritten inscription found in pencil on the front page of the Rubaiyat, a female name beginning with J, that researchers believed was the woman's personal inscription in books she owned or gave away. She was a nurse, in her late 20s at the time. When police showed her the dead man's photograph, the interviewing officer recorded that her reaction was notable. She appeared startled, then visibly composed herself. She said she did not know who he was. She denied having given anyone a copy of the Rubaiyat. She was not arrested or charged, and her identity remained officially protected for over 50 years. In 2002, retired South Australian detective Jerry Feldis published his account of the case, and by the early 2000s, journalists and researchers had identified the woman as a former nurse named Jo Thompson, who had since remarried and whose full name was suppressed until after her death in 2007. What emerged about her in the years following was a portrait of someone who had lived for nearly 60 years in the gravitational field of the secret. Multiple people who knew her in her later years described a quality of guardedness about certain periods of her life, certain cities, certain years. She did not discuss the war period freely. She did not discuss Adelaide in 1948. Before moving to Adelaide, Thompson had lived and worked in Sydney, a city that, during and after the war, was dense with military and intelligence personnel. American and British servicemen, a churning social world of nurses, officers, and logistics worker passing through. The possibility that she had met the Somerton Man there, that her connection to him predated his appearance on that beach, is consistent with the inscription in the book. Someone had written their name in it at some earlier point, as a gift or a personal mark. In the book, had ended up with the dead man on the beach. When Thompson died in 2007, her son Robin Thompson, born in 1947, a year before the events on the beach, had already attracted notice from researchers for a different reason. He bore a striking physical resemblance to the reconstruction images of the Somerton Man. The same configuration of the external ear, the same broad chest, the same unusual musculature in the lower body. Genetic genealogists and forensic anthropologists who compared photographs said the resemblance was enough to warrant serious consideration of a biological relationship. Robin Thompson died in 2009, 2 years after his mother, of a brain tumor. He had no children. The possibility that the Somerton Man was Robin Thompson's biological father, and that Jo Thompson had known exactly who the dead man was, had watched his photograph published in newspapers, had been brought to the police interview, and had maintained her silence for the rest of her life, is one of the most psychologically charged aspects of this entire case. What was she protecting? The memory of the dead? Or herself? Something institutional, a network, a promise, an obligation that survived the man who asked for it? There are questions that may never be answered, but they give the case a human weight a pure forensic analysis cannot fully carry. Whatever happened on that beach involved people with interior lives, histories, and secrets of their own. Chapter 7. Poison, and the question of how he died. The cause of death remained officially undetermined for the duration of the case's active investigation, and it remains so today. This is unusual in itself. Even in complicated cases, a cause of death is typically established to at least a probable category. Here, the pathologist concluded in writing that death was almost certainly due to poisoning, but named nothing. The tests available in 1948 found nothing. This was not a failure of diligence, but a limitation of the era. Forensic toxicology in 1948 could reliably test for arsenic, strychnine, cyanide, morphine, and carmine barbiturates, the standard array of poisons that appeared in the era's criminal cases. But an entire class of compounds existed for which no routine tests had been developed. These were the cardiac glycosides, naturally occurring compounds found in a range of plants, acting on the heart's fundamental electrical system, capable of killing in small doses and leaving no anatomical signature that a pathologist could identify without a targeted chemical test. The lead candidate, advanced most carefully by Professor Derek Abbott at the University of Adelaide, is digoxin, a compound derived from Digitalis purpurea, the common foxglove used therapeutically to regulate the heartbeat since the 18th century. At low doses, digoxin slows and strengthens the heartbeat. At toxic doses, it disrupts the sodium-potassium ion pumps that govern the heart's electrical rhythm, causing arrhythmias that escalate into cardiac arrest. One of the narrowest therapeutic windows in all of pharmacology, the difference between a medicinal dose and a lethal one, is a small multiple of a very small amount, typically 4 to 8 milligrams for a fatal oral dose in a healthy adult, against a therapeutic range of 0.125 to 0.25 milligrams per day. The compound is colorless, odorless, and in 1948 was entirely undetectable at autopsy. The postmortem findings fit congested organs, aniscochoria, consistent with autonomic nervous system disruption, darkened blood suggesting cardiac failure, and a death that was quiet enough to leave the body in a composed posture. The man did not convulse. He did not struggle. He sat against the wall, and his heart stopped. Alternative candidates include oleandrin from the oleander plant, which grows abundantly in South Australian gardens, and wabane, a related compound historically used as an arrow poison in Central Africa. All produce similar presentations. What they have in common is that they were undetectable in 1948 and that obtaining them required either access to pharmaceutical supplies or knowledge of botany beyond the casual. A nurse, and the woman on the other end of the telephone number was a nurse, would have known about digitalis, its dosage, and its forensic invisibility. This is not an accusation. It is a fact about who, in 1948, would have had both the knowledge and the access. The question of whether the poison was self-administered or given by someone else is not resolved by the physical evidence. What the setting allows is this: a quiet beach in the early hours of the morning, two people sitting together, one of them offering the other a drink from a bottle or flask. The beach at Somerton at 2 in the morning would have been empty. No witnesses, no sound but water. Chapter 8, where he went before the beach. To understand the Somerton Man's last day, it helps to lay out the sequence as clearly as the physical evidence permits. On November 30th, 1948, he arrived in Adelaide, most likely by train, given that the suitcase was deposited at the railway station's luggage cloakroom on that date. He left the suitcase, carrying only what would be found on his body: the cigarette tin, the matches, the gum, the comb, the ticket, and the copy of the Rubaiyat. At some point in the afternoon or evening, he took a bus from the city to Glenelg. The used ticket confirms this direction of travel. He did not go to Henley Beach despite having an unused ticket for that route, which may indicate a change of plans, or that the ticket belonged to a previous day, or that it was given to him by someone else. He arrived at the Somerton foreshore. Two witnesses passing at around 7 in the evening noticed him lying against the seawall and thought, reasonably enough, that he was resting. One of them believed he saw his arm move. He was alive then. The pathologist estimated death between 2 and 4 in the morning, which means somewhere between 7 in the evening and 2 in the morning. In the dark, in the warmth of the Adelaide summer, on an empty beach, something happened that no one witnessed. The gap is 7 hours. We do not know how they were spent. It is worth sitting with that gap for a moment, because it is where everything that cannot be known lives. In those 7 hours, from the warm evening when a witness saw a man apparently alive on the beach, to the deep quiet of 2 or 3 in the morning when he died, something happened. He may have met someone. He may have spent the hours alone, sitting in the dark with the water in front of him, thinking. He may have been in and out of consciousness as whatever was killing him worked through him. He may have had a conversation, or a drink, or a confrontation. The physical evidence offers no window into those hours at all. What the bus ticket and the beach together suggest is purposefulness. He did not wander here accidentally. He came from the city, specifically to this stretch of coast. Whether Glenelg was chosen because of its connection to Joe Thompson, who lived not far from Somerton Beach at the time, or for some operational reason, or for a reason entirely private to him, cannot be established. But he chose it. He came here deliberately. He sat down in a position facing the water and did not leave. There is also the unused rail ticket to Henley Beach to account for. One reasonable reading is that it represents a plan that changed. He had intended to go further north along the coast to a different suburb, and instead came south to Glenelg. Why the change? Was someone waiting at Henley Beach who he decided not to meet? Did he receive instructions or a communication that redirected him? Or was the ticket already in his pocket from a previous day, unrelated to his movements on November 30th? These questions have no answers. Chapter 9. The Cold War and Adelaide's place in it. To understand why the espionage hypothesis has never left this case, it is necessary to understand what Adelaide was in 1948, not merely as a city, but as a place on the map of the early Cold War. The year 1948 was the first fully frozen year of conflict that would last 4 decades. The Soviet Union had consolidated its control of Eastern Europe through a series of coups and political pressures that turned nominally independent states into satellite governments. The Berlin blockade began in June, was strangling the west sector of the divided German capital and testing Western resolve in ways that would define the character of the coming decades. The CIA had been formally established the previous year through the National Security Act, and in Britain, MI5 and MI6 were restructuring rapidly around the Soviet threat, with resources and attention flowing toward counterintelligence work at a rate not seen since the war. In Australia, the anxieties that would produce ASIO, formally established in March 1949, were already acute. Several years of intelligence work had established that Soviet agents had penetrated Australian government and scientific circles, and the revelations coming from the Venona Project, the joint American-British signal intelligence program that had been quietly decrypting Soviet communications since 1943, were confirming the worst fears of those who had argued for more robust domestic intelligence capability. Australia was not peripheral to these concerns. It was embedded in them. The reason Adelaide matters in this context sits about 60 kilometers north of the city, in the desert, Woomera. The Woomera rocket range was a joint British-Australian facility, operational from 1947 onwards, used for testing guided weapons and rockets that would eventually feed into the British nuclear program. It was one of the most sensitive defense installations in the Southern Hemisphere. The personnel who worked there were vetted. The surrounding city was not sealed. Hotels, boarding houses, pubs, and the ordinary social infrastructure of a mid-sized Australian city surrounded the corridor between Adelaide and the range, and foreign intelligence services were entirely capable of positioning people within that infrastructure. Adelaide was not merely adjacent to this sensitive geography. It was the gateway to it. Supplies, personnel, and information passed through the city, and a person with reason to monitor or infiltrate that network would have had reason to be there. The Venona Project, the joint American-British program that ran from 1943 and involved decrypting Soviet intelligence communications, eventually revealed that Soviet agents had penetrated the Manhattan Project, the British Foreign Office, and various Commonwealth institutions. Australia, as a member of the Commonwealth and party to intelligence sharing agreements that would eventually formalize as the Five Eyes Network, was operating in Canberra and Sydney in the 1940s, including figures with access to British policy documents and Australian government decisions. The existence of an active, functioning Soviet intelligence network in Australia in 1948 is not a hypothesis. It is documented history. What the Venona material also established is that Soviet intelligence made extensive use of Scandinavian citizens as agents and couriers. Finns, Swedes, and Norwegians could travel more freely than Soviet citizens, spoke multiple European languages, and could move between the Western world and the Soviet sphere without raising the same flags as a Russian national. Finland's position was particularly ambiguous. It had fought 2 wars against the Soviet Union in the 1940s, shared a long and porous border with it, and was subject to substantial Soviet political pressure while maintaining formal Western trade and diplomatic relationships. A Finnish national operating in Australia in 1948 would have been essentially invisible to the security services that were watching for Russian accents in Soviet passports. The parallel case of the Isdal woman is worth noting here, because the operational similarities are striking enough that several analysts have noted them independently. The Isdal woman was found dead in a Norwegian valley in November 1970 in a manner that bore structural resemblance to the Somerton Man's death. All clothing labels removed, no identification, death by apparent poisoning, luggage found separately with false identities and wigs. Her DNA, analyzed in 2017, indicated a probable origin in German-speaking Central Europe. She has never been conclusively identified. The convergence of operational details, the label removal, the false identities, the undetectable or ambiguous cause of death, the luggage deposited separately, has led multiple intelligence analysts to describe both cases as consistent with the handling of a burned or deceased operative whose identity needed to be suppressed for institutional reasons. None of this proves the Somerton Man was a spy. It establishes that the infrastructure for such a person to exist in that city in that year was real, and that the DNA evidence suggesting Finnish or Scandinavian ancestry, combined with the professional-grade identity suppression, the undetectable poison, and the coded message, constitutes a set of circumstances that does not easily accommodate an innocent explanation. Chapter 10. Omar Khayyam in the Weight of the Book. The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam is not a neutral object. It has particular cultural weight, and the Somerton Man's possession of it, in his act of tearing out its final phrase to carry in a hidden pocket, may not be accidental. Omar Khayyam lived from approximately 1048 to 1131 CE in the Khorasan region of what is now Iran. He was, in the Islamic world of his era, primarily known as a mathematician and astronomer of the first order. His work on solving cubic equations by geometric methods was centuries ahead of its European equivalents. In his reform of the Persian calendar, commissioned by the Seljuk Sultan Malik Shah in 1079, produced an astronomical year accurate to within 1 day over 3,000 years, a precision that surpassed the Gregorian calendar introduced in Europe 5 centuries later. His poetry was a secondary occupation, philosophical and often quietly subversive. The Rubaiyat, or quatrains, meditate on wine, love, impermanence, and the opacity of divine will in a way that sits somewhat at odds with orthodox Islamic piety. In the Persian tradition, his verses were appreciated, but not placed at the very highest tier. In the West, Khayyam exists almost entirely through the 1859 translation, or rather transfusion, by the Victorian poet Edward Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald was an eccentric, somewhat reclusive Suffolk gentleman of leisure who had taught himself Persian and Arabic and spent years working through Khayyam's quatrains, selecting, rearranging, and substantially rewriting them into a coherent sequence that tells, loosely, the story of a single day from dawn to night. Fitzgerald himself acknowledged the liberties he had taken, describing his method as a kind of recreation rather than a translation. He was making something new from old material, using Khayyam's imagery and philosophy as raw clay. The result is a text that is partly Khayyam and partly Fitzgerald, and partly the Victorian imagination of the East, lush, resigned, beautiful, and saturated with specific kind of cultivated melancholy. Fitzgerald published the first edition privately in 1859 and initially sold almost nothing. It was rescued from obscurity when Dante Gabriel Rossetti discovered a copy in a London bookshop's remainders, bought it for a penny, shared it with the pre-Raphaelite circle, and sparked a craze that would last a century. By the 1880s, it had become one of the most widely read English-language poems in the world, going through edition after edition, illustrated, annotated, embossed, pocket-sized, quartoed. It was carried into the Boer War, in the First World War, in soldiers' breast pockets. It was quoted in letters home from the trenches. It attracted a following among educated, slightly bohemian men who were drawn to its combination of philosophical pessimism and sensuous delight. Men who found in its elegant fatalism a permission to set aside the anxieties of the present for the simple facts of wine and companionship in the irresistible passing of time. To carry a copy in mid-century was to affiliate yourself with a certain posture, world-weary, literary, unhurried, the kind of person who could sit with impermanence without flinching. The specific edition involved in the Somerton Man's case, the Whitcomb and Tombs Pocket Edition, published in New Zealand, was one of the smaller, more portable versions produced during this period of the Rubaiyat's popularity. Whitcomb and Tomb was an established Antipodean publisher that produced affordable editions of classic texts for the colonial market. The Rubaiyat was small enough to slip into a coat pocket and was the kind of book a person might buy cheaply, read repeatedly, and carry for years. The phrase Tamam Shud appears at the very end, after the final quatrain. In Persian, it is a conventional colophon, a way of marking the end of a text, equivalent to fini in Latin. But the final stanza of Fitzgerald's translation are not merely conventional endings. They are quiet meditations on death and dissolution. The earthen vessel returning to clay, the potter's hands shaping and being shaped, the individual life, folding back into the undifferentiated matter from which it came. The very last verse in most editions describes a chamber in whose darkness the ghost of wine and song still lingers. The party is over, the revelers gone, the light fading, and then, Tamam Shud, it is finished. That this man carried those two words, specifically those two, from that specific position in the text, in the most concealed pocket of his clothing, suggests a deliberateness about endings that is difficult to read as coincidence. The rolling of the paper tightly, the secreting of it in a pocket accessible only through a fold in the waistband. This is not the action of a man who tucked a bookmark into his pocket and forgot it. It is an intentional keeping, whatever it meant to him. It was not meant to be found by strangers. It was perhaps a private statement addressed to no one, or to himself, or to whatever was waiting at the end of the evening on the beach. It is finished. I know. I accept it. I'm ready. Chapter 11. What the body told us. Beyond the clothing and the pockets, the physical body itself carried information that investigators have spent decades interpreting. He was, by all accounts, a man in exceptional physical condition for his apparent age of mid-40s. His chest was described as unusually broad and deep. His calves were disproportionately muscular relative to the rest of his body, a type of development consistent with years of specific physical training, ballet, gymnastics, certain military disciplines, or sustained occupational work that loaded the lower legs repeatedly over time. The pathologist's description of the calf musculature has attracted particular attention from those who have speculated about his background, because this kind of development is distinctive enough to narrow the field. It is not the physique of someone who ran occasionally or played weekend sports. It reflects years of a particular kind of movement, repeated until it left its mark in the architecture of muscle and bone. Ballet is the profession most commonly cited in connection with this body type, and it has a certain logic. A male dancer in mid-career would have exactly this combination of extraordinary lower leg development, a broad and strong upper body, large and capable hands, and overall conditioning consistent with elite physical training. It would also explain why someone in mid-century Australia might be difficult to identify through standard channels. A foreign dancer touring or immigrating without deep roots in Australian employment or social security systems might leave very little paper trail. But this remains speculation. And the same physique could belong to a gymnast, a rower, a mountain climber, a soldier with a particular training background, or any number of other physical specialists. His hands were large, but they showed none of the roughness of manual labor. No calluses in the palms, no scarring, no ingrained grime. This is consistent with someone who maintains physical fitness without working with their hands in rough conditions, or someone whose hands were professionally important for reasons of precision rather than power, a musician or a surgeon, or someone whose occupation required manual dexterity and whose conditioning was maintained through deliberate training rather than physical work. His teeth were in good condition, but dental records were never matched to any known person. Dental records are among the most reliable means of identification, and the failure to match his means either that his dental care had been conducted entirely outside Australia, or that relevant records were unavailable, or, less comfortably, that they had been actively suppressed. Dental records were not centralized internationally in 1948, and if his dentist was in Helsinki or Stockholm or New York, there was no practical mechanism for cross-referencing them against Australian inquiries. The physical type, reddish-brown hair, hazel eyes, fair skin, Northern European build, was initially interpreted as British or Irish. This seemed logical, given the Australian context, in the English language book in his possession. The DNA evidence would later complicate this assumption significantly, pointing instead toward Scandinavian and specifically Finnish ancestry. But the physical appearance was genuinely ambiguous. The same general physical characteristics that read as Irish or Scottish also read as Finnish or Norwegian. He was the kind of person who would not have attracted a second glance in Dublin, Oslo, or Helsinki, which is to say, he had the face of a population, not of an individual. Several reconstruction attempts were made over the decade, the most technically sophisticated being a three-dimensional digital model produced in the early 2020s using photographic analysis, skeletal measurements, and computational modeling. The result is a broad-faced, strong-jawed man with a calm, almost composed expression, a face that tells you nothing specific about who he was, but suggests someone at ease in the world, or trained to appear so. Whether it resembles any specific person in any known photograph is one of the questions that has motivated the most recent phase of the investigation. Chapter 12: Theories, Candidates, and Alternative Explanations. Over more than 70 years, the Somerton Man case has attracted a substantial range of proposed identifications and explanations, running from the thoroughly researched to the wildly speculative. The most significant deserve examination without either dismissing or uncritically accepting them. The most prominent recent candidate is the man named Carl Charles Webb, born in Melbourne in 1905, an electrical engineer and instrument maker who worked in Melbourne and had connections to Adelaide, and who went missing in the late 1940s. Webb's height and general build are not inconsistent with the physical description. His professional background in electronics and instruments is compatible with defense-related work. He had a wife from whom he was estranged, which would explain why no one came forward to identify the body. A separated spouse might not follow news from another city, or might assume an estranged husband had simply moved on. This theory gained momentum in 2022 and 2023, when DNA analysis results were said to be consistent with the Webb family line, but the identification has not been independently confirmed, and the case for Webb, though serious, remains contested. The people working on it are professional genealogists and researchers, not cranks, but consistent with is meaningfully different from confirmed, and that difference matters enormously in a case where false certainties have accumulated for decades. The suicide hypothesis has been present from the beginning and has never been fully dismissed. Tamam Shud, the hidden pocket, the beach at night, the absence of identification, all are consistent with a man who chose to die and prepared carefully for it. The difficulty is the pathological evidence and the question of method. If he poisoned himself, he somehow obtained a poison so sophisticated it was undetectable in 1948, which points towards either medical knowledge or medical connections. Why go to the extraordinary effort of removing every clothing label if the purpose was simply self-destruction? Suicides do not generally wish to be permanently unidentifiable. The labor of erasure points to something more complex, a desire to protect someone, to prevent investigation from reaching a particular person or institution, or to follow operational protocol that applied regardless of whether the operative was killed by another or chose to die. The murder hypothesis requires a killer with medical knowledge, physical access, a motive, and the capability for professional identity suppression. If the Somerton Man was an operative killed by a hostile intelligence service or by his own service to prevent him from becoming a liability, all of these elements are available within the world of late 1940s espionage. Operatives were burned regularly in this era, sometimes literally. The method, an undetectable poison, no documents, no trace, is consistent with the tradecraft of the period on both sides of the Iron Curtain. The KGB and its predecessors had a specific program for such elimination. The CIA and British services had their own versions. A less discussed but seriously advanced theory holds that he was a private investigator or a domestic intelligence operative, rather than a government spy. Australia in the 1940s had a thriving private investigation industry, and some of its practitioners worked for corporations, political organizations, or individuals with reasons to operate in shadow. This theory does not require the full weight of an international intelligence apparatus, which is its principal advantage. Its disadvantage is that it cannot comfortably account for the physical conditioning, the undetectable poison, the apparent sophistication of the identity suppression, or the finished DNA. A private detective in Adelaide in 1948 is a figure from a Raymond Chandler novel. A Finnish man with the military-grade fitness and an undetectable cardiac glycoside in his bloodstream is something rather different. The truth, if it is ever recovered, is probably simpler in outline than any of these theories, and more surprising in its specific details, as the truth usually is. Chapter 13. The Long Silence of Jo Thomson. Jo Thomson, the woman who went by the pseudonym Justine in the case literature, lived for nearly 6 decades after that December morning in 1948. She married, remarried, worked as a nurse for many years, raised a son and a daughter, moved between cities, and became, by all outward appearances, a private person of no particular historical significance. Inside that ordinary life, she carried whatever she knew. She was interviewed by South Australian police multiple times over the years, as interest in the case periodically revived. Her answers were consistent. She did not recognize the man. She had not given anyone a copy of the Rubaiyat. She had no connection to what happened at Somerton Beach. Her composure in these interviews was described by those who conducted them as remarkable. Not cold, but controlled in a way that suggested long practice. The visible startle at the first viewing of the dead man's photograph and the rapid self-correction that followed was noted in the case file and never fully explained away. What researchers uncovered after her death was a wartime and post-war history, more textured than her later life suggested. She had lived in Sydney during and immediately after the war, a city through which enormous numbers of Allied personnel passed, American, British, Australian, and in which the informal social circuits through which nurses and officers moved created connections of the kind that do not always appear in official records. The possibility that she had met the Somerton Man in Sydney years before that December evening is not documented, but is consistent with the inscription in the book. Someone had written their name in it at some point as a gift or a personal mark, and it had ended up with him. Her son Robin, born in 1947, a year before the events, shared physical characteristics with the Somerton Man that multiple researchers noticed independently before it became a public discussion. The ear morphology, in particular, the configuration of the tragus and the concha, features known to be significantly heritable, appeared similar in photographs of Robin Thompson and in the reconstruction images of the dead man. Robin himself was described by those who knew him as reserved, disinclined to discuss his origins, private in a way that sat just slightly outside ordinary privacy. He died in 2009, 2 years after his mother, without having publicly addressed the question of his paternity. He had no children, which means the direct maternal line through which mitochondrial DNA passes did not continue. The most important detail about Robin Thompson in the context of the modern investigation is a genetic one. Researchers identified what appears to be a rare dental characteristic, a form of the hypodontial, the congenital absence of certain lateral teeth, present in both Robin Thompson and in the Somerton Man. Hypodontia is a heritable condition with a known genetic basis, and its presence in both individuals strengthened the case for a biological relationship. It does not confirm it, but it is the kind of convergence that moves the question from speculation into the territory of warranted attention. What Joe Thompson chose not to say, to police, to researchers, to anyone who asked, is its own kind of evidence. Silence maintained over 6 decades across repeated inquiries is not the same as innocence, but it is also not the same as guilt. It might simply be the decision of a person who understood with complete clarity that saying what she knew would not bring the man back and might destroy things or people that still existed and still mattered. She went to her grave having kept it. It may have been the only living person who knew his name. Chapter 14. The Properties of Grief and Anonymity. There is a particular quality to the grief attached to the unknown dead. Every culture has rituals for dying, naming, mourning, burying, and these rituals serve the living as much as they honor the dead, giving sorrow a shape and a conclusion. When someone dies unidentified, these rituals remain permanently incomplete. The grave is marked with a description rather than a name. The mourners, if there are any, do not know where to go. The person becomes a case number, a category, a mystery, rather than a human being who had a mother and a history in a country he belonged to. The Somerton Man has accumulated, over 7 decades, a kind of collective mourning that is unusual in its tenderness. He is visited at his grave. He is the subject of books, documentaries, academic papers, podcasts, and websites. Strangers bring flowers. Occasionally, someone leaves a small stone on the grave marker. They remember the idea of him, the photographs, the beach, the code, the book. They bring the Rubaiyat sometimes, copies of the same pocket edition, small enough to slip into a coat. This kind of communal mourning for an unknown person is not entirely without precedent. The unknown soldier in every country that maintains such a monument performs a similar function. It asks a community to extend collective grief to an individual who cannot be named, recognizing that the anonymity does not make the loss less real. The Somerton Man's case is different in that the anonymity is not the result of war's usual chaos, but of deliberate, careful erasure, which means the grief his situation provokes carries an extra charge of injustice. He did not merely become unknown through the fog of tragedy. He was made unknown, and there is something about that active construction of unknowing that demands, almost morally, to be undone. The Rubaiyat is preoccupied with exactly this question of what remains. Omar Khayyam's verses circled the image of the clay vessel, shaped from earth, filled, emptied, broken, returned to the earth from which another vessel will be shaped. There is no immortality in the Rubaiyat, only continuation. The matter of one body becoming the matter of earth, becoming the matter of the next. It is finished. The wine is drunk, the cup is set down, another cup is filled elsewhere. That this was the book he chose to carry, and that these were the specific words he kept pressed against his body in the most secret place in his clothing, suggests a man whom had made his peace, or was trying to make it, with the ending of things, whether that ending was chosen by him or arranged by someone else. He went to it with the quiet of someone who had done at least some of the necessary thinking. Chapter 15. The Modern Investigation. The Somerton Man case entered a new phase in the 2010s and early 2020s, driven by the convergence of modern genetic genealogy and renewed institutional interest. The central figure in this phase was Derek Abbott, a professor of electrical engineering at the University of Adelaide. Not a detective or forensic specialist by training, but an engineer and physicist with a decade-long obsession with the case and a professional background in signal detection and stochastic resonance that gave him perhaps an unusual patience with systems that resist decoding. Abbott's involvement deepened in a way that became one of the stranger personal footnotes in the case history. During his research, he made contact with the granddaughter of Joe Thompson, the woman at the center of the investigation. That granddaughter, Rachel Egan, eventually became his wife. This made Abbott simultaneously the most active external researcher on the case and a man with direct personal connections to the family of a key witness, an arrangement that deepened his access to family history while raising, among some observers, reasonable questions about the neutrality of his interpretations. For years, Abbott pursued an exhumation of the Somerton Man's grave at West Terrace Cemetery in Adelaide. The legal process was complicated. South Australian coronial law, the heritage listing of the gravesite, and the question of next of kin consent created layers of bureaucratic difficulty that took the better part of a decade to navigate. The application was finally granted, and in May of 2021, the body was exhumed. DNA samples were taken from bone and tooth material, which had survived in the cemetery's dry conditions well enough to yield testable genetic information. The results were announced in stages across 2022 and 2023, and they were genuinely significant. The DNA profile was consistent with a male of mixed European ancestry, with a notable high proportion of genetic ancestry associated with Scandinavia, specifically with Finnish-associated markers. This was unexpected. The working assumption based on the man's appearance and the Australian context of his death had been that he was British or Irish. A predominantly Finnish or Scandinavian genetic profile opened entirely new lines of investigation. Forensic genealogy, the process of searching DNA databases for genetic relatives, then working outward through family trees to identify the specific individual is slow, painstaking work. It involves submitting the DNA profile to consumer databases such as GED Match or Family Tree DNA, where members of the public who have taken commercial ancestry tests may have uploaded their own profile. When a match is found, even a partial match, suggesting a shared great-grandparent rather than a direct ancestor, genealogists build family trees from that match, working through public records, birth certificates, marriage records, census data, immigration files, church records, municipal registries. The process is analogous to finding a loose thread in a vast tapestry and pulling it carefully, testing where it goes until the specific strand you are looking for reveals itself in the weave. It requires patience, access to records, and a fair measure of luck in terms of whether the right relatives have submitted their DNA to the databases being searched. The Finnish connection led investigators towards Finnish immigrant communities in Australia, North America, and New Zealand. Finnish immigration had been substantial in the early 20th century, particularly to North American industrial regions, Michigan, Minnesota, Ontario, where Finnish workers had moved in large numbers to work in mines, lumber operations, and factories. Some of these immigrants or their descendants had moved to Australia in the post-war period, part of the broader immigration flows of the late 1940s and 1950s that brought European workers to a country actively seeking to grow its population. Finnish immigrants to Australia was modest, but not negligible. Finland itself, in the late 1940s, occupied an unusual geopolitical position that bears repeating in this context. Officially neutral, bounded on one side by Scandinavia and the West, and on the other side by the Soviet Union, with a complex internal politics that included a significant communist left, in a security environment in which both Western and Soviet intelligence had active interest. The Finns had their own word for their predicament. Finlandization, which eventually entered the broader political vocabulary to describe small nations that maintain formal independence while adapting their policies to avoid antagonizing a powerful neighbor. In 1948, this pressure was at its most intense, and Finnish citizens who moved internationally were by their nature people of interest to multiple intelligence services. A candidate named Carl Webb has been examined in the context of the DNA evidence. Webb was born in Melbourne to a family with Norwegian heritage, and some researchers have claimed consistency between the Somerton Man's genetic profile and the Webb family line. Webb was an electrical engineer and instrument maker who worked in Melbourne and had connections to Adelaide, who went missing in the late 1940s, and whose estranged wife would explain why no one came looking for him. The Webb identification remains disputed and has not been confirmed by independent verification, but it is taken seriously by the researchers pursuing it, and its Norwegian rather than Finnish heritage is not necessarily inconsistent. The genetic profile of Finland and Norway overlap substantially, reflecting the shared ancient migration patterns of the Scandinavian population. As of this writing, no definitive identification has been announced. The investigation continues, and the people conducting it are working with real evidence toward what they believe is a reachable answer. Chapter 16. The Institutions and Their Silence. There is a version of this story that focuses not on the physical evidence and the individual people, but on the institutions, the intelligence services, the police, the government agencies, and what they knew, when they knew it, and what they chose to do with that knowledge. ASIO, established in March 1949, months after the Somerton Man was found, has consistently declined to confirm or deny any connection to the case. This is standard institutional practice for intelligence services. Operations are neither confirmed nor denied, regardless of how old they are or how cold the case has become. However, researchers who have sought access to ASIO files under Freedom of Information legislation have received documents that are heavily redacted, and the existence of those redactions is itself significant. It confirms that ASIO has files relevant to the case. What those files contain, whether they represent an active investigation from the early 1950s, a retrospective assessment of the man's identity, or something else entirely, has never been disclosed. The South Australian police maintained the official investigation for many years, and the case file, running to hundreds of pages, was eventually made available to researchers. The case reveals an investigation that was thorough within the limits of 1948 forensic capability, and that ran into a wall at precisely the points where formal authority was unavailable. Intelligence records, foreign government cooperation, and the full story of the woman identified as Justine. At each of these junctures, investigators noted the obstacle and moved on, unable to compel cooperation from sources that had no legal obligation to provide it. The FBI and CIA have both been queried over the decade about whether the man was known to American intelligence, given the American stitching on his shoes and the general context of American intelligence involvement in Australian security matters during the early Cold War. The American agency's responses have been standard deflections. In the context of early 1950s intelligence cooperation through the UK-USA framework, the Signal Intelligence Agreement that bound the United States, United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, it is not improbable that a man who died under the circumstances the Somerton Man did would have attracted American intelligence attention. Whether that attention produced documentation that survives, and whether that documentation will ever be released, is unknown. The larger picture is this: if the Somerton Man was an operative who died in the field, the suppression of his identity was not the act of one person removing their own clothing labels. It was, at minimum, coordinated, requiring that whoever managed his deployment also ensured that his identity could not be traced after his death. Organizations that do this kind of work have records. Those records are either sealed or they were destroyed, or they are waiting in an archive that has not been examined. The investigation into the Somerton Man is, among other things, a slow negotiation with institutional memory. And institutional memory, when it wants to remain silent, is extraordinarily patient. Chapter 17. Time, Memory, and What Remains. One of the underappreciated dimensions of the Somerton Man case is simply the problem of time. The events of late November 1948 are now more than 75 years past. Almost everyone who was an adult on that December morning is dead. Joe Thompson is dead. The constable who attended the scene are dead. The man who found the book in his car, the man who ran the luggage cloakroom at the station, the witnesses on the beach, almost all of them are gone. The pool of direct human memory has essentially emptied. What remains is physical and documentary. The body, the artifacts, the case file, the newspaper archives, the partial genetic record being built from the exhumed remains. These are reliable in the ways that documents and physical evidence are always reliable, and limited in the same ways. They record what was noticed and written down, not everything that was known or said. Memory holds things that documents can never capture. The context of a relationship, a name mentioned in passing, the background to a recorded event that explains why the event happened at all. The generation that held that memory for the Somerton Man case is gone. The passage of time has also paradoxically opened possibilities that did not exist when the investigation was active. In 1949, there was no DNA analysis, no forensic genealogy, no digital reconstruction of faces from skeletal measurements, no global databases of genetic ancestry. The forensic tools available to the original investigators were powerful for their era and completely insufficient for this case. The tools available now are almost perfectly suited to the specific nature of the evidence that survives. Bone material containing genetic information, a genetic profile that can be compared against growing databases of voluntary ancestry submissions. There is also the broader cultural shift that has made genealogical research a mass activity rather than a specialist one. Tens of millions of people have submitted their DNA to ancestry services in the past 2 decades. The Finnish Associated Genetic Profile of the Somerton Man will, with increasing probability as databases grow, produce a match close enough to work from. The question is not whether such a match will appear, but when, and whether, when it does appear, the family tree work required to trace it back to a specific person born in the early 20th century will find enough surviving documentary evidence. There is a quiet irony in this. The man who went to considerable lengths to remove every identifying label from his clothing could not have imagined that the most durable record of who he was would be molecular, stored in every cell of his body, immune to removal. The labels can be cut away. The genetics cannot. Whatever he wanted to conceal, his DNA was never part of the offer. Conclusion. The Somerton Man lies in West Terrace Cemetery in Adelaide, a grave that has been visited by strangers for 3/4 of a century. The stone carries no name, only a date and a description. In the cemetery records, he is listed as an unknown male. People bring flowers. People bring copies of the Rubaiyat, the same pocket edition, small enough to slip into a coat. Occasionally, someone leaves a small stone on the grave marker. People remember the idea of him, the photographs, the beach, The code, the book, the 2 words in the hidden pocket. They remember the way the mystery opened into itself, question leading to question, each answer containing the seed of the next uncertainty. They come because this grave, more than most, is a place where the limits of the knowing are made visible and concrete. The people who have devoted years to identifying him, the researchers, the genealogists, the cryptographers, the geneticists, the retired detectives who wrote the authoritative account, the engineer who married into the family at the center of it, are not motivated, or not only motivated, by the intellectual puzzle. Puzzles, however elegant, do not sustain decades of attention on their own. What sustains the attention is something closer to obligation. A person died here on this beach, in this city, in this specific year. That person had a name, and the name has been taken from him. Taking it back, or giving it back, feels necessary in a way that is difficult to articulate fully, but very easy to feel. Above Somerton Beach, the light continues to change throughout the day, blue in the morning, white at noon, amber as the afternoon goes long, dark by 8 in the summer when the sun lingers. The seawall where he was found is still there. The esplanade has been repaved. The suburb has grown around itself for 75 years and become something different from what it was. The world of 1948, the Cold War in its first chill, the codes and couriers, and shadows cast by great powers over small cities, the whole enormous machinery of geopolitical secrecy has transformed almost beyond recognition. The people who built that world are almost all dead. The secrets they kept have mostly hardened into history. And yet, the man on the beach has not been resolved into the past. His case is still warm. The forensic genealogists are still searching. The DNA is still being compared against profiles in databases that did not exist when he died, that have been built by tens of millions of private individuals who chose to know where they came from. Somewhere in the world, in a Finnish city, in an Australian suburb, in a North American town with a Finnish heritage community whose origins are a century old, someone carries the same genetic material he carried. Somewhere, there may be a person who has a grandfather or a great uncle who simply stopped appearing in the family story, and about whom the older relatives were always vague or always silent. When the identification comes, if it comes, it will not explain everything. It will not crack the code or tell us what was said on the dark beach or fully account for the nurse's 60-year silence. These things may remain permanently beyond reach. But a name is not nothing. A name is an enormous thing. It connects a person to the record of human existence, to families, to birthplaces, to histories, to other names. It means the grave can have the right inscription, which is not a small thing for those who understand what graves are for. Until then, he is the Somerton Man. He came from somewhere. He arrived on a summer evening with a book of Persian poetry and died before the morning with 2 words pressed against his body. The water would have been dark in those last hours, the Gulf still and black, the lights of Adelaide behind him, and whatever he was moving toward in front of him a person, a purpose, a regret, a resolution, a peace he had worked out somehow in the long thinking of his life. He sat against the wall. The night moved on. At some point, the night and the man became the same quiet thing. It is finished, he carried with him. But we are not finished yet. The work continues. The search continues. The care, the strange, stubborn 75-year-old care of a city for a stranger who washed up on its shore, continues. He was here, and we are still listening.